Congratulations on making it into week 16 of the fantasy football playoffs. Now is not the time to make a bunch of stupid mistakes. Here are the absolute traps we need to be avoiding at all costs off your waiver wire that will ruin your chances of winning the championship. If you do appreciate this video and you do feel generous today, please go down and hit that like button. It would help me and this channel out a ton. And make sure to stick around to the end of the video as well, because I will go over the players that 110% need to be dropped off our roster if you want to make room for other guys that are actually league winning. But I will never waste your time in these videos. The first absolute trap, jumping up in roster percentages and just hype in general, is going to be Justice Hill. Please avoid him at all costs. He's coming off a great game by all factors. Like, let's be completely honest. We know him to be this #1 receiving running back for this Ravens offense that came into full effect last week. He caught all 5 targets for 61 receiving yards. That's good for a 20.8% target share. 1 touchdown as well went on top of that. That's good for 17.8 fantasy points, doubling up Derrick Henry, who only saw 6.7, which is probably the most crazy part out of all of this. That's awesome. But you look into this game and you see the Giants were not in it from the absolute beginning. At halftime, they were getting blown out 21-7. Derrick Henry saw a decreased snap share because of this issue. Lamar also threw for 5 passing touchdowns. The passing offense was absolutely humming, which is good. Again, for Justice Hill, 2 things that aren't necessarily a lock to happen every single week as far as those 2 aspects go. And the Giants are top 10 matchup to fantasy running backs. They're gonna allow a lot of success to those guys. Now the Ravens come into 2 matchups that are a lot harder against the Steelers and the Texans in their last 2 games. All teams that have great run stopping defenses specifically, but are limiting more importantly to running backs in the receiving game. But Ty Johnson is another running back here that is a complete trap as well. This man put up 17.3 fantasy points last week against a very good Lions run defense. They're bottom 3 in points allowed to that position as well. It's not a great spot, but he still managed to find light and have a good day. He did that through 5 receptions for 114 yards. Keep in mind, all of that came behind James Cook as the #2 running back, but possibly even #3. We look here, the narrative for Ty Johnson is that he is this team's main receiving running back. We saw that last week. It's a valuable role in this Josh Allen offense that has a bunch of scoring potential. He's had 8 targets in the last 2 weeks while playing less than 40% of the snaps. That's a pretty good split, all things considered. And when you look at the comparison with James Cook and him, 5 receptions to Cook's 1. That's complete dominance in that aspect. But when you look a little bit deeper into the routes run per running back in this backfield, it doesn't necessarily suggest that Ty Johnson owns this role of receiving running back. And you look at the other running backs in this offense, we still have to remember Ray Davis exists. He's still technically the #2 running back in this depth chart. He saw 7 carries and 2 receptions and a touchdown as well. Just look at this entire Bills backfield here. Again, James Cook, 26.3 fantasy points, 17.3 for Johnson, and then 10.9 for Ray Davis. The success for these running backs is simply a product of the Bills offense scoring a ton. They had 48 last night. Now, to be fair, this is a team on an insane streak, and they haven't gone under 30 points in the last 6 weeks. It's just what their offense does. They score a lot of points, but they get very neutral matchups here against the Patriots and the Jets to finish out the rest of the season. I don't expect them to slow James Cook down like I do expect for maybe a guy like Alvin Kamara now dealing with injury, or possibly Breece Hall now that the Jets are really far out of playoff contention. But with all of that running back competition back there, and the fact that Josh Allen does take a lot of the rushing usage and in the red zone taking touchdowns as well. Yes, he's a little bit banged up, but it's just not a spot where Ty Johnson needs to be rostered. But MVS is another guy, a wide receiver here that continues to be on this list. We do not need to be adding this guy. He had a decent game if you look at all things considered. 7 targets, only 2 receptions, but he did have 64 yards and 8.8 fantasy points on the day. But we have to be realistic here. This offense is way too depleted. They don't have Chris Olave. They don't have Rashid Shaheed. They don't have Derek Carr, even though he might come back in a matter of weeks, possibly as soon as this week. Taysom Hill isn't here. The offense is completely one-dimensional and is pretty predictable. We saw Marshawn Lattimore come back in his first game against the Commanders. He allowed 0 targets, 0 receptions, and 0 fantasy points to every single wide receiver on every single snap that he did play. But Marquez Valdes-Scantling himself is way too boom bust at this point in the season. At your flex play, you want to be going with guys that probably have a good matchup because you wouldn't be starting them regardless. When you look at MVS's next matchup, he gets Jair Alexander against him next week, and then after that, the Raiders, who are a complete run funnel of a defense. They don't have the best passing defense, but you don't need to do that when you're playing the Raiders. It just is what it is. Despite being the wide receiver 1 and playing over 60% of the snaps, the most consistent wide receiver in this offense, he's only averaging 2.8 receptions a game. It's just not something you can trust. But another guy that had a great week, defying all odds here, 100% a trap still though, is going to be Devin Singletary. Despite the Ravens, who are bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed to running backs this year, he managed to put up 13.1 fantasy points on 8 carries, a touchdown, and 3 receptions in that matchup. All things considered, that is impressive, which did outshine Tyrone Tracy, who had 4.5 fantasy points. And when you look at it, the snap split between the two was a lot closer this week than we've seen pretty much the entirety of the season after Tyrone Tracy became the RB1 a couple weeks into the season in that aspect. But people are believing this and seeing this, and okay, maybe Devin Singletary can kind of work his way back in. Maybe he'll get a 50% split in the next week. But in this matchup against the Ravens, they were still both extremely inefficient. A lot of Singletary snaps did come in garbage time. Now, the entire game was almost garbage time because they were down 21-7 at halftime. But we've seen time and time again in these blowouts, the snap differential between starters and non-starters is a lot closer than you'd expect, and it's not something we can bank on and consistently see. So Devin Singletary is not a guy we need to be adding. The Giants do get the Falcons and the Colts in their next two. Tracy will probably bounce back in those matchups. They are relatively positive, but Devin Singletary won't be doing that, especially not in a blowout. It also doesn't help that he's been averaging less than 3 yards per carry since the Giants week 11 bye. But last week, we see Waddle go down early in the game with a knee injury. We don't know how serious it could be, but knee injuries are never good. Considering that he never came back into this game despite leaving early, it could suggest that he's going to be missing time. At this point in the year, any time missed is essentially out for the entire season because we only have 2 weeks left of fantasy football, and Malik Washington took a huge benefit from him not being in this offense. This team cuts Odell before the week starts, and then Malik gets moved up. His snap percentage increased a ton, the highest that he's seen all year. He finishes with 5 receptions for 52 yards. That's good for 10.2 fantasy points. Nothing absolutely crazy, but that number itself might just be able to be flex numbers for you. So it looks like, okay, maybe we have a new wide receiver 2 for an offense that is top 10 in passing attempts. It's not the same offense that we had last year with Tua and the amount of passing volume and the yardage and just general efficiency, but still one that could possibly garner a number 2 wide receiver that could be flexible. You look at their next few matchups, they get more negative ones against the 49ers and the Browns, but my answer to this question here is that we still have a ton of target competition in this offense. There's no way for Malik Washington as a rookie to be consistent in this offense. We have Jonnu Smith. He's averaging just under 10 targets a game. If you're isolating the last 5 weeks of the season, we still have Tyreek in this offense. Yes, he hasn't been as efficient as his previous years. He's having kind of a down year in general, but Achane is also leading the running backs in receptions per game. When you have all of those guys allocated with targets and allocated with usage, Malik Washington is going to be more of a boomer bust guy that we don't want to be putting at our flex spot, especially considering he has more negative matchups coming in the next few weeks. But Tim Patrick, if you're looking for a wide receiver, is not a guy that needs to be added, and I do see the appeal for him 100%. We look at the last 2 weeks, he had a total of 15 targets, 10 receptions, and 3 touchdowns, that being against pretty good defenses in the Packers and the Bills, all things considered. But like the Lions, the Bills are scoring at an insane amount. It's probably not going to come down, though. The last 2 weeks, they've had 42, 34, and they're averaging 32.7 points a game for the entirety of the season. That is just unheard of. It allows these other wide receivers, especially in blowout situations, to get involved more. So Patrick's role also hasn't changed in this offense. He's playing about the same amount of snaps as he was in the beginning of the year. So how all of a sudden did he go from 1 to 2 catches a game now to 4, maybe 5 over the last 2 weeks? Well, that answer for you is going to be pass volume. That is essentially it. This year, the Lions are 24th in passing attempts per game, but if you look over the last 2 weeks, they have been absolutely insane in their passing volume. 59 passing attempts. That has to be like a career high for Jared Goff last week, and then 41 against the Titans the week before that. That's just not normal for this offense, especially when you have a really good run game and Dan Campbell's coaching scheme with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. So he's not going to be trustworthy moving down the stretch. He needs touchdowns to be viable. Again, he's had 3 in the last 2 games. They've been good games. He's gotten his usage early. It's not like it's garbage time. They've been close as well. Like, he's decent, but it's just not something we can trust. We have Amon-Ra. We have Laporta, even though he's not really doing anything in the receiving game. Jameson Williams takes the top off of defenses and gets a lot of looks that way. And he gets negative matchups against the Bears and the 49ers to finish out the season. So it's not like we have a plug-and-play situation again, which is kind of what you lean more for flex guys than you do for actual starters. But here's the promised list of players that are 110% safe to drop off your roster. You can add other guys like backup quarterbacks, maybe backup defenses, or just players you don't want your other league mates to have. It's kind of the smarter idea now that you're in the back half of the fantasy playoffs, because you don't most likely need to be starting those 3rd, 4th, 5th options on your bench. The first guy here is going to be Tyler Lockett. He didn't have the best game. He had some usage, but he hasn't really been that guy over the past few weeks. If DK can't perform, Tyler Lockett is not going to be a guy either. Then we'll go into the guys that are just injured and are rostered in a lot of leagues but can be dropped at this point. Jonathan Brooks is not going to play for the rest of the season. Evan Ingram is also out for the year with a shoulder injury. We can drop Alec Pierce. He's another guy that's dealing with injury. He came down with a concussion last week. He could play. He could come back in this year, but at this point, the offense isn't good enough. There's no reason to be rostering him. And other guys like Dawson Knox, Amir Abdullah, you can get them off your roster as well. But that's going to finish off this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. All glory to the man above.